this is Jim Schaefer, host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is Marina Whitman. I should say Marina von Neuman Whitman. And we're going to talk about her book, The Martian's Daughter. Welcome to Rip Rap.
Thank you, Jim. I'm glad to be here.
We should talk a little bit, perhaps, about the Martian, who is a central part of this narrative, but not the dominating.
I was wondering when you were going to ask me why the book was called The Martian's Daughter. And it's not because I think it might accidentally capture a few science fiction fans, but it's because there were 5 Hungarian scientists, of whom my father was one, who were called the Martians. And the story goes, and I can't personally vouch for it, was that one night a number of the people who were working on the Manhattan Project were sitting on top of the mountain in Los Alamos, drinking beer and talking, and they weren't allowed to leave, so there wasn't much to do in the evening, so they were kind of killing time. And one of them said, how come that so many of the geniuses associated with this project come from this little country that nobody can find on a map called Hungary? And somebody else said, well, the truth is, they're not really human beings at all. They're Martians. But in order to disguise the fact that they come from Mars, they all speak Hungarian.
But there was a very interesting thread about this formative aspects of the relationship between father and daughter. I mean, you know, he was just an absolute genius. I don't think there's any other way to look at it. You know, what he did with his life and what he did and developed himself was just extraordinary.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, he invented game theory. He was one of the pioneers of the modern computer. In fact, the architecture of the computers that you and I have on our desk is called the von Neumann architecture. And he was a leading force in the Manhattan Project. And in a way, I spent my whole life trying to get out from under the shadow of a larger-than-life parent. And many people who've had such powerful figures as parents say the same thing. And my mother was no slouch either, in a very different way. She had kind of made up her own career as she went along. She was a pioneer too in some ways. She went to work during World War II as a Tilly the Toiler, and within 6 months she was running the whole training program for women building radar sets. And she was very glamorous, very tempestuous, could charm a room full of people. And I think she sort of felt I was her ugly duckling. And so my father had a certain set of expectations, and my mother had a certain set of expectations, and society had a set of expectations, which is that I would be a good wife and mother and use my first-class education to pass things on to my children. And then I had my expectations. And in a way, my life story was somehow bringing these all together.
Well, it's fascinating to me because one of my research interests is in gifted children, and this is the struggle that goes on. With gifted children in the educational system, the teachers often have trouble understanding who these students are. They feel threatened by them, or they feel they want to dismiss them and not sure what to do. And I think the parents along the same way. What do you do with it? You have your gifted, but what do you do with a gifted child who doesn't shape up according to your standards?
Well, I was very lucky. First of all, I've described the atmosphere my parents had in their households, and I say households plural because they were divorced when I was not yet 3 and both remarried. So these were households in which intellect was taken for granted. And also, I was lucky enough, and my parents were able to afford to send me to some really outstanding schools, so that I also had teachers who delighted in having bright students and didn't mind being challenged by them. And unfortunately, that's not the story for the great majority of American children.
Well, one of the other things I noticed is your father put a lot of his feelings into writing.
Amazing. You know, nowadays especially. I had the sense to save some of those letters that he wrote to me. And every night he wrote, usually to my stepmother, his wife, who was a very bright but very difficult person. She was terribly insecure. She eventually committed suicide. And every night, just about, he would write her a long letter, reassuring her, telling her, yes, he did love her, and no, she wasn't a disaster. She actually became, when he was building the first, or one of the first modern computers, she actually was his programmer. So even though she'd never formally gone beyond high school. But it's just that he could shift. First of all, his writing, his sentences and so forth were spectacular. And these were the ones in English, which was his second or third or fourth language. I don't read Hungarian, but I'm sure they were at least as brilliant in Hungarian. And they would go on for pages and pages and pages. And when he was writing me these heartrending letters about why he didn't want me to get married young, he would, in the same letter, suddenly address a question I had asked him about rationality and free will, and he would just shift from one to the other, and about the senior thesis I was writing on a 17th century French theologian that nobody ever heard of. And, you know, that's something that's been lost. I don't think people today write letters like that. And I can't help wondering what the historians of the future are going to do, because piecing together emails, even if they can be read by 14 generations of machines in the future, just don't have that quality. And it was just incredible what he could do with a pen and a piece of paper.
How did it feel? I mean, you had one reaction when you saw them the first time, and then when you were preparing the book, you probably went back over them. What was your feeling doing that?
Well, I don't remember the actual reading of them the first time. I remember my emotions when I got these letters and how conflicted I was when he was talking about why he didn't want me to do what I wanted to do. And also I realized that from literally as soon as I could read, he just couldn't help putting pressure on me about school performance. And, you know, if I got an A- in something instead of an A, he wanted to know why. It was all done in a very loving way, and I wasn't punished or anything, but it's just that his expectations were so clear that I didn't feel I had any alternative but to fulfill them. And then I found these letters, and I honestly didn't even remember that I had saved them, and thank goodness I did. And then I read them all at once, and I could piece together how incredibly passionately, emotionally he had felt about things. And I don't think at the time that quite came through the way it did many, many, many years later when I read them all over. I don't think I saved every letter he ever wrote me, but I seem to have had some kind of wisdom to save particularly important ones.
Now, with your own children, have you continued the tradition of writing?
I hate to say it, but we really haven't. Mostly it's the telephone. My grandchildren, of course, are into texting, but my children and I mainly talk on the phone. But I hate to say it, I have not kept that up. And again,
Oh, it's really fascinating because there is this shift in literacy.
That's right.
And illiterate practices. And like you were saying earlier, we're also losing the historical record.
Yeah, and that's really troublesome. My grandson happened to hit second or third grade, at a time when the school system decided not to teach cursive writing. So here is this highly intelligent 16-year-old who can't read cursive. And when I taxed him with that, he said, "Oh, Grammy, nobody uses that anymore anyway." And I said, "Well, I do. And I would like if you," and he himself, of course, can't write so anybody can read it. And so, of course, he uses the computer. And he writes beautifully, and he likes to write. But the notion that writing might actually involve the artistic practice of forming letters that were legible to other people just doesn't occur to him. It's not part of his set of communication tools.
It's a really interesting development. As someone who teaches writing, the loss of fluency and literacy is just really remarkable.
It's absolutely remarkable. And this is a kid, as I say, who likes to write. He writes poetry, he writes stories, he writes papers. But there's none of this, how do I say, sort of physical involvement of putting a pen to paper. Fortunately, by the time his sister came up 3 years later, the school system had decided maybe they ought to teach cursive after all. But
one of the other developments was the involvement of the Institute for Advanced Study. And maybe we ought to talk a little bit about that, because that also is a joint activity here.
Well, the Institute for Advanced Study is a unique institution. I caught myself almost saying somewhat unique, and then realized that my English professor husband wouldn't approve at all. It was founded in 1932 by a family that had made its fortune in department stores, Bambergers. And if you come from the East, as I do, that was a name to contend with, although I don't think they ever made it into the Midwest. And after some feeling around for what they wanted to do, they decided to create this institution where geniuses could come and receive a very comfortable salary and have no obligation except to think. They didn't have to teach. Most of them did write, but there was no publish or perish requirement. And it ultimately was built in a very beautiful part of Princeton, and it has gorgeous woods, and many people think it's part of Princeton University. It's not. It's an independent organization with its own endowment and its own board, but it's in Princeton. And there's a lot of intellectual exchange between the two. And so I grew up in this environment and my father was one of the 5 first members of the Institute. Einstein was another, and then there were 3 other mathematicians. Later, it also expanded into physics and the social sciences and arts and culture. But initially, it was all mathematics. And so during my high school years, when I lived with my father, the Institute was sort of one of my environments. I had others, obviously, as a teenager. And then about 10 years ago, I was asked to become a trustee of the Institute. And I'm sure my heritage had something to do with that, because most of the trustees are either chosen by their universities to represent a particular field, or they're enormously bright people who are also billionaires so that they can keep the endowment healthy. So I'm a little bit of an oddball there, but I thoroughly enjoy it. And I do sort of see the ghost of my father looking on in wonder at his daughter sitting there as one of the trustees of this institution, which actually was his intellectual home for the bulk of his adult life. He went off and did a lot of other things during the war and after the war, as a consultant or to various parts of the defense establishment and so forth. But in fact, that was his base from the time he came to the United States permanently, full-time in 1933, I guess, until really, well, he went to the Atomic Energy Commission, but that was just, he was just on leave. And then the question of what he would do after he left the AEC was still up in the air when he became ill and died. So for the whole time I was conscious of him as my father, he was part of the Institute.
And I found that fascinating that both he and you had these significant people as colleagues and people you interacted with that both inspired you and helped you sustain yourself. You know, like Albert Einstein is just one of those spectacular personalities that I don't think people still understand. They can talk about the theory, but they don't really fully understand it, I think.
Well, certainly having very smart colleagues, and my father had not only colleagues but also close friends who were the same kinds of whiz kids, and the family dinner table would have a smattering of these people several nights a week. They weren't all in the same field by any means. I mean, there was Arthur Koestler, who wrote probably the most influential anti-communist novel ever written. And then there were Edward Teller, who was a physicist, and just all kinds of people. The only thing that linked them was that they were very, very smart. And at my mother's table, my mother was actually the first employee of Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island. And so her dinner table tended to be populated by people who were either at Brookhaven or visiting Brookhaven or whatever. So wherever I turned, there were these incredibly smart people.
And that carried over, though, with yourself, because there are other people you were involved with that were
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, I count among good friends people like George Shultz and Paul Volcker and Alice Rivlin, who's much in the news these days on the deficit issue. And actually, the blurbs on the back of my book are written by people like that. And these are my friends. And I don't mean to say by any means that all my friends are like that. We have lots of friends, and many of them are not people whose names are household words. They're just good friends and interesting people.
What was interesting to me is that these are people who are both academics and powerful, because they're shaping the theory, but they're also shaping the impact it has on our culture.
Yes, and my father's career kind of divided into two parts. Up until World War II, he really was embedded in the world of theoretical mathematics, and he published loads of papers on that, and that is inevitably a kind of isolating pursuit. But then, as first of all, he saw Europe going down the tubes and came to the United States in the early 30s and decided that if civilization was going to survive, it was going to be in the New World. And then as soon as we went to war against the forces of darkness, he plunged in with both feet, and mainly with his head as well, and got very deeply involved in what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And for the rest of his life, much of what he did was no longer pure mathematics, although I think he did keep his finger in there too. But he got involved in the world of power and decision-making and so forth.
Which was considerable.
Which was considerable.
Yeah. So I just was fascinated with this book, and I liked it as an academic book because one thing we were talking about was the phrase that you have for the last chapter of having it all.
Oh, well, having it all means to me, and I sort of talked about this, but without using that phrase. There were all these different expectations. My father had that I should be achieve something intellectually and professionally. My mother that I should achieve a certain degree of poise and elegance, and my own, which included those, but also including having a family. And that, as I look back, eventually I managed to fulfill all these expectations. And that's really what I mean by having it all.
But I noticed you weren't entirely satisfied. There was still kind of a wanting to extend.
No, that's true, because I suppose every now and then I think, gosh, I made a difference by being there. But how much did I really change things by what I did as opposed to what I was? And when I wrote the dedication of my book to our son, who is a professor of molecular biology and biochemistry at the Harvard Medical School, and I said to him, I have always both admired and envied the clarity of your goals. He knew exactly what he wanted to set out to do in terms of making basic discoveries in his field that would impact on mankind. And I never quite had that clear a set of goals. And so I can't look back and say that when I made this decision or that decision, it really had an impact. The fact that I was there, I think, had an impact, but it's a subtle difference, but it's a real one.
But isn't it also kind of the curse of genius, is that you're aware that you did something and you're still asking yourself, what else could I have done? What else should I have done? And it's that self-question. I think it's just great.
It could be. I don't know if it's the curse of genius or the curse of just having set your sights very high. And by the way, one thing that having been so close to my father made me realize that there are lots of people who are very bright, and I guess I'm one of them, but I'm not a genius. My standards for what it means to be a genius are also very high.
Well, I disagree. I thought this was one of the most brilliantly written books that I've read, and I've read a lot.
Oh, thank you.
It's very well written.
I really labored over it, and it took me about 6 years. And I think the first draft was much too, quote, academic in the negative sense. And eventually I was lucky enough to have as a very brilliant and very ruthless editor, Leonard Downey, who was for 17 years the editor of the Washington Post. So he certainly had a sharp blue pencil. And because my daughter is married to his son and we have common grandchildren, he undertook to edit that book and to make it very clear to me what it would take to put it in language that would make it compelling. And I will be forever grateful to him for doing that.
It's always fascinated me, the community for an author's project. You have the editors and other editors,
right,
and you have the publisher, and you have this whole, and the research that you do, and the other people who are involved, who are colleagues who are reading the manuscript saying, well, I don't know about this.
And don't forget the graduate students who
right,
did the research. I couldn't believe how much research is involved in digging out your own life. You'd think if this is my life, why would I have to do research on it? Well, it's incredible how much you have to do. And if I hadn't had 2 terrific research assistants and Google, I'm not sure I ever would have been able to write the book.
Well, that was fascinating, because you said you started off with just one narrative, just the initial draft and then work from there. And
That's right. One of my friends who had been nagging me for years to write this finally said, okay, Marina, we're going to sit down. I'm going to sit at my computer, and you're just going to do stream of consciousness, and I'm going to type it. And so 3 2-hour sessions later, I had 76 pages of stream of consciousness, and that's where it began.
well, I think that it's a great book, and I enjoyed reading it. And I think it's academic. It's not stuffy in terms of, because, you know, with our program, there's people who've written very lively academic books.
Oh, yes.
So, but I enjoy the ability to look behind the scenes and look at this interaction between you and your father, but also all the other colleagues that you and he had.
Oh, yeah.
And then the commitment
amazing
forward,
people.
realizing high expectations.
It's sad that nobody has ever really written a good biography of my father. And I happened to be at a gathering at Harvard last weekend where one of the other attendees was Walter Isaacson, who wrote the wonderful book on Einstein and most recently the book on Steve Jobs. And he said to me, Marina, why don't you write a biography of your father? And I said, there are 99 reasons. 1, why I couldn't, and 2, why I wouldn't. But Walter, you are the person who, having done such a terrific job on Einstein and on Steve Jobs, should undertake to write a biography of von Neumann. And he said he'd think about it, so I'm hoping.
Well, it's that same thing, though, of being involved, and then you have responsibilities to what's happening, to do even things that you're not necessarily comfortable doing, but they're important to be done. And I think this was an important task that you did very well.
Thank you.
So
Thanks
thank
so
you for
much,
being on
Jim.
Rip Rap.
I really enjoyed it.